He was somewhere between 20 and 25 when they put him in the ground. His bones were strong, his teeth showed no disease. He'd eaten well his entire life, better than most people in the Nile Valley ever would. He wasn't sick, he wasn't old, he wasn't injured. He was buried 3 meters from a king. His grave was one of over 300, dug in rows, radiating outward from the royal tomb at Abydos like spokes from a wheel. Young men, young women, craftspeople, attendants, all healthy, all dead at the same time. 5,000 years ago, when a king of Egypt died, he did not go alone. The people who served him in life were sealed into the earth beside him, because the Egyptians believed their king would need them on the other side. They didn't fight. As far as we can tell, none of them fought. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. The ground at Abydos does not look like a graveyard. It looks like a construction site someone abandoned mid-thought. Low ridges of sand, crumbled mud brick walls no higher than your knee, shallow depressions that could be anything until you learn what they are. Flinders Petrie worked here in 1899 and 1900, and the photographs from his expeditions show a desert floor pocked with rectangular cuts, methodical and close together, like cells in a honeycomb, flattened by 5,000 years of wind. He recorded what he found with the unsentimental precision of a man cataloguing hardware. Skeleton, position, grave goods, orientation, depth. He did not linger over the implications. The graves were a problem to be measured, not mourned. But the measurements tell a story he never fully wrote down. The site is el-Ka'ab, Mother of Pots, in Arabic named for the sheer density of ceramic fragments littering its surface. Beneath that debris field lie the tombs of Egypt's earliest kings, rulers from the First Dynasty, roughly 3,100 to 2,900 BCE. These are not the grand pyramid complexes that most people picture when they think of royal Egyptian burial. They are subterranean chambers, mud brick-lined, timber-roofed, modest by the standards of what came later. The kings buried here ruled a civilization still finding its shape, still learning how to be an empire. And surrounding their tombs, arranged in tight rows and deliberate clusters, are the subsidiary graves, hundreds of them. Petrie counted them. The German Archaeological Institute, which re-excavated the site decades later, counted them again with better methods and sharper tools. The numbers vary slightly depending on how you define the boundaries of each complex, but the scale is consistent. Around the tomb of King Jer, who ruled sometime around 3000 BCE, the excavators identified over 300 subsidiary burials. 300. Around Djet, his successor, roughly 170. Around Queen Menith, and she is one of the few women granted a royal-scale burial in this period, over 40. Around Den, who reigned longer than most of his predecessors, 136. These are not family plots. They are not the burials of people who died over decades and were gradually interred nearby out of loyalty or tradition. The evidence, and I want to be careful here because this is where the argument gets contested, points overwhelmingly toward simultaneous interment. The graves show no signs of being reopened. The fill layers are uniform. The skeletal positions suggest single-event placement, not sequential additions over time. And the people inside them were, almost without exception, young. I've read the osteological reports more times than I should probably admit. The age profiles repeat: late teens, 20s, early 30s. Some individuals are younger, a few are older. But the central cluster, the densest concentration of subsidiary graves around any given royal tomb, skews young and skews healthy. These were not people who died of plague or famine. Their bones show adequate nutrition. Their joints show use consistent with active work, not chronic deprivation. Many had teeth in better condition than the general population of the period. They were, by every physical indicator we can extract from remains this old, alive and well, right up until the moment they weren't. And that moment, the manner and mechanism of their death, is where the evidence goes quiet. No inscription from the First Dynasty explains the practice. No ritual text survives that describes how these individuals were selected, how they were prepared, or how they died. We have the bodies, we have the graves. We have the spatial arrangement, close to the king, organized by what appear to be occupational groupings. We have personal items buried alongside them, small pottery vessels, copper tools, bone implements, ivory labels, and in some cases stone stelae, bearing names and titles. What we do not have is a single written sentence from the people who designed this system telling us why. The silence in the record is the loudest part. What we can say, and this is where the scholarly consensus holds, even among those who disagree about details, is that these burials were planned. Architecturally planned. The subsidiary graves were not afterthoughts. They were dug as part of the original construction of the royal funerary complex, laid out in rows and grids that mirror the geometry of the king's own burial chamber. Someone, an architect, a priest, an administrator acting on instructions we'll never read, decided how many graves were needed, calculated the spacing, assigned the positions. This was infrastructure, bureaucratic, precise, and deliberate in a way that makes the stomach tighten when you think about what it means. Because the graves were dug before the people in them were dead. There is a particular quality to this kind of planning, not the emotional horror of it, though that's real enough, but the administrative quality. The same organizational habits that would later produce Egypt's great building projects, its meticulous grain records, its elaborate census documents, those same instincts were here, at the very beginning, applied to the logistics of accompaniment in death. How many servants does a king need in what the Egyptians believed was the afterlife? How many craftspeople? How many women from the court? Someone calculated this. Someone drew it up, and then someone carried it out. I've spent a long time with these records, and what unsettles me is not the violence, though violence is the right word, even when it's wrapped in ritual. What unsettles me is the completeness. Every aspect of this was absorbed into the ordinary machinery of royal administration. There was no separate category for it, no special horror attached to the planning. It sat alongside the requisition of timber for the king's coffin, the procurement of oil for his wrappings, the organization of pottery vessels for his provisions. The killing, if that is what it was a line item. Now, I need to be honest about what we don't know because the temptation to fill the gaps with certainty is strong, and I've seen it happen in too many documentaries. We do not know whether these people were killed outright, by poison, by strangulation, by some other method, or whether they went willingly into sealed chambers and waited for the air to run out. We do not know whether they were coerced, drugged, persuaded, or genuinely willing. The bones don't tell us. Soft tissue, which might have shown evidence of poisoning or ligature marks, is almost entirely gone. A few skeletons show possible signs of cranial trauma, but the sample is small and the preservation is poor enough that taphonomic damage, post-mortem changes caused by time, pressure, and environment cannot be ruled out. What we have is proximity, simultaneity, youth, and health. A population of people who were alive and well, who were buried at the same time as a king, and who did not end up in those graves by accident. The conventional scholarly term is retainer sacrifice. It appears in the literature with a clinical cleanness that almost obscures what it describes. And even that label carries assumptions. Sacrifice implies a ritual framework, a theological motive, a logic that may or may not have been felt by the individuals on the receiving end. Some scholars prefer retainer burial or subsidiary burial, terms that describe the physical arrangement without committing to an interpretation of motive. I tend to use them interchangeably, which probably says something about my own inability to settle the question in my own mind. But here is what the arrangement itself tells us, regardless of what we call it. The subsidiary graves are not scattered randomly. At Dia's complex, they form dense rows running parallel to the walls of the king's burial chamber. At Den's tomb, they cluster in a way that suggests functional grouping. Certain graves contain tools associated with specific crafts. Others contain items linked to personal service. Others are marked with stelae that identify the occupant by name and title. The dead were organized. Their roles followed them into the ground. A craftsman was buried with the tools of his trade. A woman identified on her stela as a member of the royal household was buried with cosmetic implements, small vessels, and items of personal adornment. These were not anonymous bodies thrown into pits. They were individuals, given names, given goods, given positions within the architecture of a dead king's underground household. And that word, household, is the key to the entire practice. In the earliest period of Egyptian kingship, the royal household was not simply a domestic arrangement. It was the administrative core of the state. The people who served the king, his attendants, his craftspeople, his cupbearers, his women, his scribes, were the apparatus through which royal authority functioned. They were not employees in a modern sense. They were extensions of the king's person, bound to him by a relationship that, in the Egyptian understanding of the world, did not end at the boundary of death. When the king crossed into what the Egyptians believed was continued existence, he would need the same apparatus, the same hands, the same skills, the same loyalty. At least that is the logic as best we can reconstruct it. The Egyptians of this period left no theological treatise explaining why they did this. We are reading the practice backward, from the evidence to the belief, and the distance between them is wide enough to lose certainty in. But the graves are real, the bones are real, the rows are real, and the planning, the cold, meticulous, administrative planning, is real. That is where this story begins. Not with a pharaoh's ambition, not with divine right or eternal glory. With a grid of empty graves waiting to be filled and the quiet bureaucracy that decided who would fill them. Something about the spacing has always bothered me. The subsidiary graves at Abydos are not identical. They vary in size, some barely large enough for a body and a few pots, others spacious enough to hold a wooden coffin, a collection of vessels, and what appear to be personal belongings arranged with care. But the spacing between them is remarkably consistent. Roughly 1.5 meters, grave to grave, row to row, across entire complexes. That kind of regularity doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone is working from a plan, when someone has drawn lines in the sand or scratched measurements onto a piece of limestone and handed them to a crew of diggers who executed the design without deviation. I keep returning to the diggers, the men who cut the pits. They knew what the pits were for. They had to. The funerary complexes of the First Dynasty at Abydos consist of two distinct elements, and understanding their relationship matters for grasping the full scope of what happened here. The first element is the tomb itself, the subterranean burial chamber at el-Ka'ab, where the king's body and primary grave goods were placed. The second is the funerary enclosure, located about 1 kilometer to the north, closer to the edge of the cultivated floodplain. These enclosures, massive mud-brick walled rectangles, some covering areas larger than a football pitch, were the sites of rituals connected to the king's death. Scholars believe they functioned as stages for funerary ceremonies, as places where offerings were made, and possibly as symbolic palaces for the dead king's spirit to inhabit in what the Egyptians understood as his continued existence. Both elements had subsidiary burials. That's the part that doesn't get enough attention. The graves around the tomb at el-Ka'ab are well documented and widely discussed. The graves around the funerary enclosures less so. But the excavations, particularly those led by Matthew Adams and David O'Connor at the enclosures north of Abydos, revealed rows of subsidiary burials running alongside the outer walls of these massive structures. The pattern mirrors what we see at the tombs themselves, young adults, healthy, buried simultaneously, accompanied by goods that reflect their roles, which means the practice was not confined to the king's burial chamber. It extended across the entire funerary landscape. The king's death activated a system with multiple sites, multiple construction phases, and multiple groups of people who would not survive it. The logistics of this bear thinking about. Consider Jer's complex, over 300 subsidiary burials at the tomb site, additional burials at the funerary enclosure. The construction alone, digging that many graves, lining some with mud brick, preparing wooden coffins for others, manufacturing or collecting the grave goods, required coordinated labor over weeks or months, all before a single body was placed. Then the burials themselves, the transport of bodies or living people to the site, their placement in the correct graves, because the arrangement was not random, it was organized, the sealing of each pit and the final closure of the complex. This was a project. It had a timeline, a workforce, a supply chain, and someone managing the whole thing. I've handled administrative papyri from later periods, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, that detail the logistics of state-sponsored construction projects with extraordinary precision. Grain rations for workers, shift schedules, tool inventories, material requisitions. The Egyptians were, from very early on, compulsive record keepers when it came to organized labor. And while no equivalent documents survive from the First Dynasty, the writing system was still in its infancy, used primarily for labels and short identifications rather than extended administrative texts. The physical evidence at Abydos tells us the organizational capacity was already there. The same mines that would later track every basket of limestone chips at a pyramid construction site were already, 1,000 years earlier, tracking every grave in a retainer burial complex. The stelae are where the personal becomes unavoidable. Small limestone slabs, roughly carved, found at or near many of the subsidiary graves. Not all graves had them, perhaps a third, perhaps fewer, depending on the complex. But those that did bore names and titles. Short inscriptions, sometimes just a name and a determinative sign indicating sex or role. These are among the earliest examples of Egyptian writing used to identify individual people, and they were placed at graves dug for the express purpose of killing or entombing those people beside a dead king. I want to stay with that for a moment. The earliest use of personal identification in the Egyptian written record includes markers for people who were buried alive or killed so that a king might, as the Egyptians believed, have servants in the afterlife. The technology of individual identity in Egypt begins partly in the service of organized death. I'm not sure what to do with that, but it's there. The titles on the stelae offer glimpses, narrow, frustratingly incomplete, but real, into who these people were. Some are identified as personal attendants. Others carry titles linked to specific crafts or services, a maker of stone vessels, a keeper of oils, a woman of the inner palace. A few stelae depict the individual in a seated position, sometimes accompanied by a small offering table, suggesting that whoever commissioned the stela intended it to function not just as a label, but as a miniature funerary monument, a provision for the individual's own afterlife, even as that afterlife was being spent in service to the king. That dual purpose catches something essential about how the Egyptians understood this practice. These people were not, in their system's logic, being destroyed. They were being relocated. Their existence, as the Egyptians conceived it, would continue. But it would continue within the framework of the king's household, on the other side of death, performing the same roles they had performed in life. The grave goods confirm this reading. A craftsman buried with miniature tools, a cupbearer buried with small drinking vessels. The goods are not symbolic in the way a modern memorial might include a favorite object. They are functional, or rather, they were believed to be functional. The Egyptians expected these items to work, and this is where the discomfort deepens. Because once you accept the internal logic, Not endorse it, not agree with it, but simply follow it to its conclusion, the practice looks less like mass murder and more like a transfer of personnel. A bureaucratic reassignment carried out at the boundary between life and death. The violence is not denied by this reading. The violence is absorbed into the system so completely that it ceases to register as violence within the framework of those who designed it. The killing, or the dying, depending on how it was carried out, was an administrative act, an act of state planning, and the people inside the graves were treated, right up to and including their deaths, as members of a functioning institution. Not because the system was kind, because the system was thorough. The physical arrangement of the graves reinforces this. At some complexes, the subsidiary burials closest to the king's chamber contained individuals with the highest status grave goods and the most prominent titles. The proximity gradient, closer to the king means higher status, mirrors the spatial hierarchies of Egyptian palace architecture, where access to the king's person was the ultimate measure of rank. In death, as in life, your position relative to the center of power defined who you were. The architecture of the cemetery replicated the architecture of the court. I've stood in museum storerooms looking at the stelae from these graves, small stones, most of them no larger than a hardcover book, chipped and worn and difficult to read even under good light. The names on them belonged to people who were young and skilled and close to power. People who, in a different century or a different civilization, might have lived full lives defined by their abilities rather than by their proximity to a dying king. And yet the stelae were carved for them. Someone took the time, someone wanted their names recorded, whether for bureaucratic reasons or something closer to care, I genuinely cannot tell, and placed the stones where they could be found. 5,000 years later, we found them. And the names came back. Not all of them. Many stelae are damaged beyond reading. Many graves never had them. But some. Enough to make the dead specific. Enough to make the numbers into people. The funerary enclosures add another layer of complexity that most treatments of this subject skip over. These structures, sometimes called valley enclosures, to distinguish them from the tomb sites at al-Ka'ab, were massive, built of thick mud brick walls, and they were deliberately destroyed after use. Archaeologists have found evidence that some enclosures were systematically demolished when the next king built his own, as if the ritual space was designed to serve a single reign and then be erased. The subsidiary burials associated with these enclosures, however, were not demolished. The bodies remained, the graves remained. The enclosure walls came down around them, burying them deeper, and the next king's construction crew built over or around the older graves. Which means the landscape of Abydos, by the end of the First Dynasty, was layered with the dead. Each king's funerary complex overlapped with the last. Each generation of subsidiary burials sat alongside, and sometimes on top of, the previous generations. The ground was saturated with the remains of people who had been placed there by a system that consumed them and then moved on. There is a detail from the excavation of the enclosure associated with King Kasekemwi, one of the last rulers of the Second Dynasty, by which point the practice of retainer sacrifice was waning, that I think about more than I should. His enclosure, known today as the Shunet el-Zebib, is the best preserved of the abydos funerary enclosures. Its walls still stand several meters high, and near its northeastern corner, the excavators found a small number of subsidiary burials, far fewer than the hundreds associated with earlier kings. A handful. The practice was fading, the numbers were dropping, but it hadn't stopped entirely. A few people still went into the ground beside the king. I keep thinking about those last ones, the ones at the end of the tradition when the numbers had shrunk from hundreds to a dozen. Were they the most loyal? The most unlucky, the last believers in a system that even the kings were beginning to abandon? The evidence doesn't say, it never says, and the archive says nothing, which is itself a kind of answer. Skeleton B37, subsidiary burial complex of King Jia, abydos. Female. Estimated age at death, 20 to 25 years. Dental wear consistent with a grain-based diet supplemented by animal protein. Better nutrition than most of the population in the Nile Valley during this period. No signs of chronic disease, no healed fractures, no evidence of anemia or childhood nutritional stress in the long bones. Slight wear patterns on the right shoulder and elbow joints, suggesting repetitive activity, grinding, possibly textile production, possibly both. Height, approximately 155 centimeters. Buried in a flexed position on her left side, facing east. Grave goods, 2 small ceramic vessels, a fragment of a copper bracelet and a bone needle. That is everything we know about her. Everything we will ever know. The bioarchaeological literature on the abydos subsidiary burials is thin. Not because scholars haven't tried, but because the material fights back. Petrie's excavations in 1899 and 1900 were conducted with the methods of his time, which means many skeletons were recorded in situ, measured, and then left in the ground or removed without the kind of preservation protocols that modern osteologists would insist on. Some were sent to museums, some were stored in conditions that accelerated deterioration. Some simply disappeared into the chaos of early 20th century excavation logistics, when crates were shipped across oceans and institutional record-keeping was, at best, inconsistent. The German Archaeological Institute's re-excavation of al-Ka'ab in the 1970s through the 1990s brought modern standards to the site, but by then much of what Petrie had exposed was disturbed, eroded, or gone. What remains, what can still be studied, is a fraction of the original population, enough for patterns, not enough for certainty. But the patterns are stark. Age at death clusters tightly. Across the subsidiary burials associated with multiple First Dynasty royal tombs, the overwhelming majority of individuals for whom age could be estimated fell between approximately 18 and 35 years old. The peak concentration, the ages most frequently represented, sits in the early to mid-20s. There are outliers. A few adolescents, perhaps as young as 15. A few individuals in their 40s. But the center of the distribution is unmistakable. These were young adults in what should have been the most productive years of their lives. The health data compounds this. Nancy Lovell, a bioarchaeologist who has published extensively on early Egyptian skeletal remains, noted that the subsidiary burial populations show fewer signs of nutritional stress and disease than contemporary, non-elite cemetery populations from the same period. Their teeth are better, their bones are denser, their growth patterns suggest adequate, sometimes generous, access to food during childhood and adolescence. These were not people pulled from the margins of society. They were people who had been fed, maintained, and kept in condition. Like livestock, a part of me wants to say, though the comparison is unfair in both directions, unfair to the dead because they were more than bodies being maintained, and unfair to the evidence because maintenance implies an investment that the archaeological record confirms. They were valued. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all the data. The grave goods make this explicit. In the subsidiary burials with the richest assemblages, excavators found objects that reflect skill, status, and personal identity. Copper tools, expensive in this period when copper required long-distance trade networks to acquire. Stone vessels carved with a precision that speaks to specialized craft knowledge. Ivory objects, some incised with decorative patterns. Jewelry, bracelets, beads, amulets. Cosmetic implements, ground pigment palettes, small containers for oils and unguents, the same kinds of personal grooming tools found in high-status Egyptian burials throughout the historical period. And names. On the stelae that survived, names. Not all of them readable, not all of them translatable. The writing system of the First Dynasty was still rudimentary by later Egyptian standards, and some signs remain disputed among epigraphers. But where reading is possible, the names are accompanied by titles that locate the individual within the structure of the royal household. Titles linked to personal service, titles linked to craft production, titles that, in later periods, would evolve into the elaborate bureaucratic rank systems of the Old Kingdom. In the First Dynasty, they are simpler, but the function is the same. They tell you who this person was in relation to the king. A woman identified as a member of the inner palace, a man with a title connected to the provisioning of royal meals, an individual, sex uncertain from the surviving inscription, whose title appears to relate to the manufacture of linen. These were specialists, people with skills the court depended on, and the decision to kill them, or to bury them alive, or to administer poison, or whatever the method was that the evidence refuses to disclose, was a decision to destroy functioning expertise in service of a belief about what a dead king would require. I've spent enough years with these sources to know when I'm projecting, and I want to flag this moment honestly. The emotional weight of that last sentence is mine, not the Egyptians'. To the people who designed this system, the destruction of expertise was not the point. The transfer of expertise was the point. In their understanding of reality, these craftspeople and attendants were not being eliminated. They were being sent ahead, relocated to a place where their skills would continue to serve. The waste that a modern observer sees was, within the Egyptian belief framework, not waste at all. It was provision, investment, long-term planning for a king's eternal household. Hold both of those truths at the same time if you can. I've been trying to for 20 years. I still can't do it cleanly. There's a category of subsidiary burial that the literature mentions less frequently, and I want to bring it forward because it complicates the picture in ways that matter. Among the graves surrounding certain royal tombs, excavators found burials that contained not human remains but animal remains. Dogs, lions, donkeys. In some cases, these animal burials were integrated into the same rows as the human subsidiary graves, spaced with the same regularity, furnished with their own small grave goods. The animals, like the humans, were part of the king's entourage. They, too, were believed necessary for the afterlife. I mention this not to equate humans with animals, though the spatial treatment is disturbingly similar, but because it reveals something about the conceptual framework driving the entire practice. The king's afterlife household, as the Egyptians imagined it, was a complete ecosystem. It required people of specific skills. It required animals of specific types. It required tools, food, drink, textiles, cosmetics, furniture. Everything the king had in life, he was believed to need in death. And the subsidiary burials were simply the human component of a provisioning system that extended to every category of the king's earthly existence. The system did not distinguish in its architecture between a cup-bearer and a hunting dog. Both occupied graves of similar construction. Both were placed according to a predetermined plan. Both were, in the logic of the system, resources allocated to ensure the king's comfort and function in eternity. That equivalence, not stated by the Egyptians but enacted in their burial practices, is the part I find hardest to sit with. If you've ever felt invisible inside an institution, felt that your role was valued but your personhood was beside the point, then you have a thread of connection to what these graves represent. Not a direct line. The distance is too great, the context too different, but a thread. Let me return to the bones for a moment, because there is one more physical detail that deserves attention before we move on. Among the subsidiary burials at some complexes, a small number of skeletons show evidence of perimortem skeletal trauma. Injuries that occurred at or very near the time of death. These include, in a handful of cases, possible blows to the skull. The evidence is contested. Some scholars argue that the damage is consistent with intentional force. Others point out that post-mortem taphonomic processes, the weight of overlying soil, the collapse of grave structures, the movement of sediment over millennia, can produce fracture patterns that mimic perimortem trauma to the untrained eye, and sometimes even to the trained one. The honest answer is that we cannot tell from the bones alone how most of these people died. The honest answer is that the method of death is, for the vast majority of the subsidiary burial population, archaeologically invisible. We are left with inference, with context, with the overwhelming circumstantial evidence that hundreds of healthy young people do not die simultaneously by coincidence and get buried in pre-dug graves around a king by accident. But the mechanism, the final minutes, the physical act itself, gone, lost in the gap between bone and breath. I've read every published report I can find on these remains. I've sat with the data tables, age estimates, sex determinations, pathology notes, preservation scores. And at a certain point, the data stops being data and starts being people. A woman in her early 20s with good teeth and a copper bracelet and a bone needle placed on her left side in a pit she did not dig, facing a direction she did not choose, 3 meters from a king whose name she may have spoken every day of her working life. Skeleton. B37 had skills. She had a name we'll never read because her stealer, if she had one, did not survive. She had a body that was maintained and fed and kept healthy by a system that needed her alive right up until the moment it needed her dead. And then the system closed around her, and the earth closed over her, and 5,000 years of silence began. Seal the door. Fill the shaft with rubble. Pack the earth down hard. Whatever happens next happens in the dark. The royal burial chamber at el-Ka'ab, Jez, since his is the one with the largest subsidiary complex and therefore the one that demands the most from us, was not large by the standards of later Egyptian tombs. A mud brick-lined pit, roughly 7 by 4 meters, timber-roofed, sunk into the desert substrate to a depth of about 3 meters. Inside, the king's body, wrapped and treated with resins in what passed for mummification in this early period. A rough practice, nothing like the elaborate embalming of later centuries, surrounded by stacks of pottery vessels, stone jars, ivory furniture components, copper tools, and carved labels identifying the contents of goods that have long since disintegrated. The chamber was functional, austere even, a storeroom for a dead man's necessities. But those necessities, as the Egyptians of this period believed, extended far beyond objects. The theology of early Egyptian kingship is not something we can reconstruct with the precision we'd like. The pyramid texts, the oldest surviving corpus of Egyptian religious literature, date to the late 5th and 6th dynasties, roughly 500 to 700 years after the First Dynasty burials at Abydos. They describe the king's afterlife in vivid, layered, sometimes contradictory terms. The king rises to the sky, joins the circumpolar stars, sails in a celestial boat, eats with the gods, commands the spirits of the dead. These texts were carved into the walls of pyramids, and they preserve ideas that scholars believe are significantly older than the surfaces they were inscribed on. Some passages contain archaic grammar and vocabulary that suggest origins deep in the pre-dynastic or early dynastic periods, possibly as far back as the era of the very kings buried at Abydos. If that's true, and the argument is plausible, though not provable, then the people who designed the subsidiary burial complexes may have been operating within a belief system recognizably ancestral to the one the pyramid texts would later articulate. A system in which the king was not simply a powerful man who died. He was, as his court understood him, a being whose transition from life to afterlife was the most consequential event in the cosmos. The continuation of the world, the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the maintenance of cosmic balance depended, in their reckoning, on the king's successful passage. He could not fail, and he could not make that passage without the infrastructure to sustain him on the other side. The word infrastructure sounds cold. I mean it to. Because what the Egyptians were building at Abydos was not a memorial. It was, by their own understanding, a functioning installation, a facility designed to support a living being in a place that required everything the visible world provided and then some. The king would eat. That required cooks and cupbearers and the vessels they used. The king would dress. That required attendants and textile workers and the oils and linens they produced. The king would rule. That required administrators and scribes and the ceremonial apparatus of a court. The king would hunt, travel, hold audience, receive offerings. Every activity implied a staff. Every staff member implied a body in a grave. This is the logic that produced 300 subsidiary burials. Not madness, not cruelty for its own sake. A belief system pursued to its conclusion with the full organizational capacity of an emerging state. And here is where I need to say something that might sound like an excuse, but isn't meant as one. The Egyptians who enacted this practice were not, as far as we can tell, unusual in the ancient world. Retainer sacrifice, the burial of attendants alongside a ruler, appears independently in multiple early state societies, in the royal tombs of Ur in Mesopotamia, in early Chinese dynastic burials, in certain West African kingdoms, in pre-Columbian South America. The practice emerges again and again at a specific stage of political development, when centralized power is new enough to require dramatic demonstrations of its reach, and when the theological apparatus of divine or semi-divine kingship is still raw enough to demand literal fulfillment of its claims. This doesn't make it less terrible, but it does make it less alien. The impulse, the belief that a ruler's power and needs survive death and that others must be sacrificed to serve those needs, is not an Egyptian aberration. It is a recurring feature of early complex societies, a pattern that appears wherever absolute authority meets religious conviction and the organizational capacity to act on both. The political dimension of retainer sacrifice at abydos is harder to separate from the theological one than most accounts suggest, and I think the difficulty is the point. When a king dies and 300 people go into the ground with him, the message is not purely religious, it is a demonstration. Every person who witnessed the construction of those graves, every family that lost a member to the subsidiary burial complex, every official who participated in the logistics, all of them received the same message. The king's power does not stop at the boundary of death. His reach extends beyond his final breath. To serve the king is to belong to the king, in this life and in whatever comes after. That message was aimed at the living, not the dead. The subsidiary burials were visible during construction. The graves were dug in open ground. The funerary enclosures, with their massive mud brick walls, were prominent landmarks on the abydos landscape. The entire process, the building, the burial, the sealing, was a public event, or at least a semi-public one, witnessed by the court, the workers, the local population. And what they witnessed was the totality of royal authority made physical, not an abstract claim of power, a concrete demonstration. These people are going into the earth because the king requires them, and no force in the visible world can prevent it. I think about the families sometimes, the ones left behind. No text mentions them. No inscription records a mother's grief or a brother's protest or a wife's silence. The archive, as always, protects the system and forgets the people outside it. But the families existed. The subsidiary burial populations were drawn from the royal household, which means they were drawn from communities, from families who lived near the palace, who worked in its orbit, who depended on its patronage. When the king died and their son or daughter or spouse was taken into the burial complex, those families continued to live in the shadow of the institution that had consumed someone they loved. I can't reconstruct their experience. I have no sources for it. But the absence of sources is not the absence of suffering, and I refuse to let the silence of the archive become permission to pretend the suffering didn't exist. There is a term that appears in later Egyptian texts, much later New Kingdom period, that I think casts a long shadow backward across the centuries, even though applying it to the First Dynasty is technically anachronistic. The term is hemut, often translated as servant or dependent, though neither English word captures it fully. A hemut was a person who belonged to an institution, a temple, a royal estate, a household. The belonging was not metaphorical. It was structural, legal, economic. A hemut's labor, a hemut's body, a hemut's time, all were allocated by the institution. The hemut was not a slave in the way the word is used in the context of the Atlantic trade. The relationship was different, embedded in reciprocal obligations, tied to specific roles, often hereditary. But the core fact remained: the hemut did not belong to herself. In the First Dynasty, the terminology may have been different, the concepts may have been less formalized, but the subsidiary burials suggest that something functionally similar was already in place. A relationship between the royal household and its members so total that it extended past death. The people in those graves belonged to the king, not as possessions in a crude sense, but as components of a system that could not function without them. And when the system demanded their presence in the afterlife, it collected them. The theological justification was real, the political utility was real. And somewhere in between, in the space where belief meets power, and both are reinforced by ritual, the practice sustained itself for roughly 2 centuries. 200 years of kings dying and taking their households with them. 200 years of graves being dug before the people who would fill them had stopped breathing. And then it stopped. Not with a proclamation, not with a revolution, not with a crisis of conscience, or if there was one, no one recorded it. The practice tapered, the numbers declined, the subsidiary burials grew smaller, less elaborate, less central to the funerary architecture. By the late Second Dynasty, they were marginal. By the Third Dynasty, the age of Djoser, the age of the first stone pyramid, they were gone. The king still needed servants in the afterlife. As the Egyptians believed, his cosmic role had not changed. His need for a functioning household beyond death had not diminished. But the method of provision had shifted, and what replaced the living bodies in the subsidiary graves was something smaller, quieter and, from a modern perspective, infinitely more merciful. Though mercy, I suspect, had nothing to do with it. A Shabti figure from the Middle Kingdom, the ones mass-produced in faience workshops along the Nile around 1900 BCE, fits in the palm of your hand. 10 centimeters tall, maybe 15. Mummiform. Arms crossed over the chest. Face simplified to a few grooves representing eyes, nose, mouth. On the body, columns of hieroglyphic text. Chapter 6 of what would later be compiled as the Book of the Dead, spelling out the figure's purpose in terms so explicit they border on contractual. The spell, as the Egyptians wrote it, is addressed to the figure itself. It commands the Shabti to answer when the deceased is called upon to perform labor in the afterlife, to plow fields, to carry sand, to irrigate canals. If the deceased is called upon to do any work in the realm of the dead, the text reads in paraphrase, "You shall say, 'Here I am.'" The Shabti answers instead. The Shabti works instead. The Shabti takes the dead person's place, a substitute made of clay or stone or glazed ceramic, costing a fraction of what it cost to feed, house, train, and then kill a human being. The transition from retainer sacrifice to Shabti substitution did not happen overnight, and it did not happen in a single step. Between the last subsidiary burials of the late Second Dynasty and the first recognizable Shabti figures of the Middle Kingdom, a gap of roughly 600 to 800 years, the Egyptians experimented with other forms of afterlife provisioning that trace a slow, uneven path from the literal to the symbolic. Servant statues in Old Kingdom tombs, painted scenes of workshops and kitchens and breweries on tomb walls, depicting in meticulous detail the labor the dead person expected to have available. Model workshops, miniature wooden figures of bakers, brewers, weavers, butchers, placed in burial chambers as three-dimensional versions of the same idea. Each iteration moved further from the body and closer to the image. Each iteration preserved the underlying theology while reducing the human cost to zero. This is where the textbooks stop. Let's keep going. Because the conventional narrative, the one that appears in survey courses and museum wall texts and the kind of documentaries I don't make, frames this transition as progress. A civilization maturing, moving from barbarism to sophistication, replacing a savage practice with an elegant symbolic solution. And that framing is not entirely wrong. The killing did stop. The substitutes did work within the logic of the belief system. The outcome, by any humane measure, was better. But the framing hides something, and the thing it hides is the part I care about. The belief did not change. The theology that produced retainer sacrifice, the conviction that the king required a functioning household in the afterlife, that his cosmic role demanded permanent service, that the people who served him in life owed him that service in death, survived intact. Every Shabti figure in every museum collection on Earth is a monument to that continuity. The spell inscribed on each one is a direct descendant of the logic that put 300 people in the ground beside King Jer. The words changed, the material changed, the bodies stopped, the idea did not. I've handled Shabtis in museum archives, hundreds of them, stacked in drawers, sorted by dynasty and provenance, some exquisitely carved and others so crude they're barely recognizable as human forms. Late period tombs sometimes contained hundreds per burial. 401 was the ideal number in certain periods, one for each day of the year, plus 36 overseers to manage the labor gangs of 10. The Egyptians, true to form, systematized even the afterlife's workforce. They created an organizational chart for the dead. And standing in those archives, pulling open drawer after drawer of small silent figures, I have never once been able to stop thinking about the graves at Abydos. The technology improved. That's what happened. The Egyptians did not have a moral revelation. They had an engineering breakthrough, the discovery that symbolic substitution, executed within the proper ritual framework, could satisfy the same theological requirements that had previously demanded human lives. The Shabti was not an act of conscience, it was an act of efficiency. Or maybe that's too harsh. Maybe I'm being unfair to a civilization I've spent my entire adult life trying to understand. Maybe, somewhere in the transition, in the generations between the last subsidiary burial and the first servant statue, there were people who felt relief. Officials who no longer had to organize the logistics of mass death. Families who no longer had to surrender their children to the funerary complex. Court members who could serve a king for a lifetime and expect to be buried in their own tombs, in their own time, with their own names on their own stelae. The sources don't tell us if anyone felt that relief. They rarely tell us what anyone felt about anything. Feelings were not the kind of information the Egyptian state bothered to archive, but something shifted, and the shift was permanent. After the Second Dynasty, no Egyptian king ever again required living attendants to accompany him in death. The practice, once the centerpiece of royal funerary architecture, once the most dramatic expression of the king's total authority over the bodies and lives of his court, disappeared so completely that later Egyptians appear to have had no memory of it. No New Kingdom text references the subsidiary burials at Abydos. No late-period scribe records horror or admiration at the practice. It was gone, erased. Not by deliberate suppression, as far as we know, but by the simple passage of time and the replacement of one technology of belief with another. The Shabti did the work the dead had done, and the dead at Abydos were forgotten. There are other theories about why the practice ended, and I owe them a fair hearing. Some scholars have argued that the decline of retainer sacrifice correlates with the consolidation of centralized state power during the Second and Third Dynasties. As the king's authority became more secure, less dependent on dramatic demonstrations, the political function of subsidiary burial became less necessary. The king no longer needed to prove, through the visible sacrifice of his court, that his power survived death. He could prove it through architecture instead. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, the first monumental stone structure in Egyptian history, appeared at exactly the period when subsidiary burials vanished. A coincidence of timing that several scholars have noted and none have fully explained. Others have pointed to economic factors. Trained servants, skilled craftspeople, experienced administrators. These were expensive to produce and difficult to replace. A king who killed his entire household at death left his successor with a depleted court, a gap in institutional knowledge, a need to recruit and train an entirely new staff. As the Egyptian state grew more complex, the cost of retainer sacrifice, measured not in moral terms but in organizational disruption, may have become unsustainable. The Shabti was cheaper in every sense. And then there is the possibility, unprovable, but I find it difficult to dismiss entirely, that something less quantifiable was at work. A slow shift in how the Egyptians understood the boundary between literal and symbolic action. A growing confidence that ritual, properly performed, could achieve results that had previously required physical enactment. The idea that a painted servant could serve as effectively as a buried one. That a spoken spell could substitute for a sealed grave. This is not a moral awakening. It is a theological refinement, a society learning to trust its own symbolic systems enough to stop requiring proof in flesh and bone. I don't know which explanation is right. Probably all of them in varying proportions that shifted across generations and regions and individual decisions that no one thought to record. The practice ended, the reasons compounded. The graves at Abydos stayed in the ground, silent, while the civilization that created them moved on to build pyramids and paint tombs and manufacture shabtis by the tens of thousands, and never once looked back at the rows of bodies it had left behind in the desert. I want to end with a small thing, not a grand conclusion, not a lesson, something I saw. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the old one, the overcrowded one on Tahrir Square, before the move to the Grand Egyptian Museum, there is a display case on the upper floor that most visitors walk past without stopping. It contains Shabti figures, dozens of them, packed tightly on shelves, blue-green faience, most no larger than a pencil. They are generic, mass-produced, unremarkable by museum standards. The label gives a dynasty, a provenance, a brief description, nothing about what they replaced. And in a climate-controlled storage room somewhere in London or Berlin or Philadelphia, I've been in several and they blur together after a while, there are small limestone stelae from Abydos. Chipped, faded, bearing the names of people who were young and skilled and alive, and then were not. The stelae and the shabtis are stored in different rooms, in different museums, on different continents. Nobody puts them next to each other. Nobody draws the line between them. But the line is there. The shabti exists because the stela exists. The small faience figure answering "Here I am" on behalf of the dead is the descendant of a system that once answered the same theological demand with a human life. One replaced the other, and the replacement was so complete, so successful, so thoroughly absorbed into Egyptian practice that the original, the bodies, the graves, the names on the stones became invisible. The stone remembers what the system wanted to forget: 300 graves, young bodies, healthy bones, a copper bracelet, a bone needle, a name no one can read anymore, carved on a slab of limestone no larger than a hand, placed at the edge of a pit dug before the woman inside it had finished living. That's what it cost for a while to make a king immortal.